This week on Steve and Friends, we have Regan Boychuk. Regan's running in the next provincial election in Alberta, Canada, underneath the Green Party. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to Steve and Friends, another episode. We have Regan Boychuk from Alberta, Canada, running underneath the Green Party with us today. Now, I've tried to avoid any political aspects to the show simply because I want it to be very inclusive. But I thought, for one, Regan's a kind of a reoccurring guest on our show, kind of covering the topic of Alberta oil, which consists mainly of oil sands. But also, I think there's a bit of a tie-in with Steve Keane's run last year in the the Australian, all the A's, election, and running for an independent party. And the Greens here, the Alberta Greens and the federal Greens, are very much independent, don't get any media attention. So I see there might be a topic of connection there between the two. So we're going slightly political today. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keane channel and like the video. Comment underneath. That's really cool. If you have any comments for our guests, put them underneath the video. The guests will come back, check it out, maybe even answer your questions. If you're over on Twitter watching this, well, retweet, like, and then come over here because you can chat here in our little side chat thing. Oh, there we go. There's Mike right there. Mike's already chatting. Mike always sets the chat off, so it's much appreciated, Mike, because at this point you're the Lone Ranger on the chat. Oh, there we've got Botched Mandela, a regular. Thank you, Botched, for coming in and saying hello. I'm going to bring on the man himself, Professor Steve Keane.
Oh, yeah.
How you doing?
I'm trying hard to match you in your sartorial elegance by having a tracksuit matching your suit and tie. So I'll be radical even might even show some cleavage. Yeah. One of my don't show a t-shirt anymore, Steve. The svelte body I used to have is part of my history rather than part of my future.
Well, I think it's great that I'm the only one wearing the suit because it makes me look moderately sophisticated to some degree. Yeah.
Maybe even getting a loan from you. Look like you're financially viable.
Yeah, that or I've got like a court date that I'm going to, and I want to impress a judge.
Well, you're trying to sell me your property. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's bring on Mike Radzicki. Oh, wrong one. There we go.
Hi guys, what are y'all doing?
I think you did actually, before we really get carried, you should actually get rid of your virtual background for a second and show your real background, because your real background has quite an unreal element to it. And I want you to be on live YouTube, explain why you have a skeleton in not in your closet, but by the looks of it on your display cabinet.
Okay, so you want me to?
Yeah, come on, show off the skeleton. Come on, skeletons. If there's a skeleton in the closet, he has one on his. There you go.
Okay, so we have a backyard. We have a backyard golf tournament, and the logo is no skulls. Don't skull the ball. So instead of hitting the ball with the face of the club, if you hit it with the edge, it goes flying. That's a skull. Don't do that. And the logo is a skeleton man playing golf. Everybody got a T-shirt, and so everybody started sending me skeleton stuff. So that's one of them. Here's another one. So we got a lot of skeleton T-shirts at my house. So
I got skeletons in the economic closet as well. So let's bring them out and bash the shit out of them. So bring on the guest. Back to your virtual background, Mike.
Right.
You know,
Hello,
Mike, I am in awe that any man can bring his skeletons out of the closet.
They are on display.
Let's bring on the man, Regan Boychuk.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome back. You are a reoccurring guest on the show. It's either because we are running out of guests or because I like you or Steve likes you. We'll kind of decide that through the rest of the show. If anybody's also wondering, before we get to Regan, I'll mute Steve. He's got a little bit of a background feedback issue going on. Daniel Sanderson is not with us anymore. He has been relieved from his duties from the show. If you want to find out why, you'll probably have to stick around to the end of the show to find out. We wish him the best going into the future. Regan, what's going on right now in your life?
Well, the writ dropped in Alberta. It's the month of May is an election period in Alberta, and May 29th, Alberta elects a new government in a period of economic turbulence with a recession coming and political. It's a bizarro world in Alberta these days. Things have changed quite a bit, and we got a chance to change them again at the end of the month.
So, wait a minute. You're running for an election?
I'm a political scientist, a political economist, but worked on oil and gas issues, trying to get reform. Alberta has the lowest royalty rates on earth, collects less than anybody. I've been watching it for 15 years. It keeps going down and down. Even a couple elections ago, we surprisingly elected a reformist government, but even they were unable to change, reform any of those issues and actually made them worse. And so continued frustration of working on these issues finally leads me to get involved in politics despite my better judgment or wishes, but doesn't seem to be any other way to make the change other than jumping in the ring.
Absolutely. What party are you running for?
I'm with the Green Party of Alberta, the biggest third party. There's two main parties in Alberta, one kind of representing the far right and another one more centrist. But the problem for Albertans is that those two parties agree on energy issues. When it comes to oil and gas, there's no difference, no disagreement between the two parties, and it leaves us voters without any choice. These are big, important issues that shape the economics of Alberta. And by chance, things are really close this election. The two main parties are neck and neck. It could go either way. It's 49-51. They keep trading favors and mistakes, leaving an enormous opening for a third party. Alberta hasn't had a minority government since the 20s when we had proportional representation. But this time it's a plausible way to force reform on absolutely critical foundational issues in Alberta that haven't really been up for debate for the public in a long time. And if there wasn't a Green Party, a third party shaking things up and offering a little bit of an alternative, we wouldn't be offered any choices this election either.
Right. So being a smaller party, you could say, even with a couple seats as MLAs, you could make a big swing between the parties. You could be that swaying factor in votes. Is that correct?
It's pretty much the ideal situation you could imagine, where a small party is the kingmaker. We have 49 seats on both sides. 1 or 2 seats for the Green Party would make us the kingmakers and could force a compromise for a coalition government on either side of the spectrum. When it comes to these oil and gas issues, there's absolute consensus across Alberta. Every self-respecting Albertan wants to get paid for the resources we own. We don't want the mess left behind when they're done. And so I work in rural Alberta over many years across the political spectrum, across the social spectrum, and we all agree and work on these issues. There's between the UCP base and the NDP base of those two parties, there's overwhelming support for regulatory reform, collecting more royalties. It's just not being offered by the political leadership of either party. It's not being debated in the media. And for some strange reason, in a place like Alberta that has trillions of dollars of resources that are publicly owned, they're in the crown, Regan, a roofer who has no economic training and could barely work a spreadsheet when he started exploring these issues, is the only person in Alberta that studies royalties and the public share of 200 billion of oil and gas and bitumen production. For some reason, there's no economist, there's no academic, no public intellectual, there's no scholarly work on these issues, except for Regan, who has been publishing reports, op-eds for 15 years on these issues, meeting with the bureaucracy, meeting with the ministers, sharing all my research. But there's something strange happening. Like logic, facts do not apply on these issues. And for 15 years, I've been studying Alberta and oil and gas and economics. And I think literally in the last couple of weeks, I finally made sense of what is actually going on in Alberta, what explains this curious fact that the biggest, most, I study oil and gas because it's the biggest, most important thing. Just look at Alberta, you live here. So I started to study it when I got out of grad school. I'm the only one. That's really weird. The parties don't want to talk about. That's really strange. It's really hard to explain, but it comes down to history, and that's something missing from economics curriculum, not by accident, uh, but as I struck sense, what I've developed in Alberta as a roofer is two data sets that are unique on the oil and gas industry. It's incredibly hard to get data on oil and gas, but Canada's really lucky. The federal government legislatively imposed economic cost reporting on industry. Stats Canada collects all the production data, volumes, prices, development costs, exploration costs, operating costs. And so uniquely, we have a really good understanding of the economics of the oil and gas industry in Alberta. And that's what I put together. And it's incredibly insightful about what's actually going on, but it's at complete odds with the public discussion, the media discussion. There's gobsmacking amounts of profit. The public collects almost none of it. Of every dollar that comes out of the ground, citizens in Alberta that own it, we get 5 cents. OPEC would to collect 50 cents of every dollar. Many countries around the world collect 70, 80, 90 cents of each dollar. Alberta collects 5. And I've been studying for 15 years and it's gone down 15 times. And I've been trying to make sense of that, trying to find an answer. Instead, everywhere I look, I found fraud. Every think tank report, every bank report, every government royalty review, anywhere economists come within a country mile of any of these issues, it's just flat out fraud. It's not all you have to do is look. And I've been struggling to make sense of that in Alberta. And it turns out that in 1938, the US basically took over Canada, declared us part of the Monroe Doctrine. Britain formally transferred us to the US control before the Second World War. And the US imposed a doctrine of foreign policy, much like they have the Discovery Doctrine that they use to justify taking over First Nations land. There's another doctrine called minimum duty, where you're not allowed to apply your law to foreign investors. And it's a sort of rule they imposed on Mexico 100 years ago with the Marines, that you have to treat American companies better. You can have all sorts of nice laws, but you can't apply them to American companies. And it turns out that's actually what the US imposed on Canada in 1938. We didn't appreciate it right away, but going back through the history book, it's really clear. And we found out, as the kids say these days, FAFO. 10 years later, in 1948, we tugged on our leash to find out whether we controlled the oil being developed in Alberta. After the Second World War, Leduc #1, the oil industry really took off in Alberta. Next year, we tried to raise royalties. We had a couple of land sales and we were collecting 60 or 70 cents of every dollar. And this was a big threat to industry. And there was a giant accident. In March 1948, we had the biggest onshore accident in Canadian history, a blowout in a billion barrel field of Imperial Oil, Exxon's field. And it blew out of control for 6 months through an entire election campaign until the government won again and until they passed a law promising to only collect 16.7 cents per dollar. Uh, and so royalties were lowered dramatically, reversed, and they promised to only collect that much. But a wrench came in August 1971 when Alberta elected a new government. We got democracy and we broke out of that. We got to charge more in royalties. That's the
All
place I
right.
grew up in.
All right. So we know what the issues are in Alberta. If you were in the position of making change or helping change the policy in Alberta that would benefit Albertans, what does that change look like? What are those policies?
It's basically a competition between two doctrines: the US doctrine of minimum duty, where we can't hurt US investors, or from 1971 to 1991, Alberta had a new political party, the Progressive Conservatives, backed by a local billionaire, and they reasserted independence and sovereignty in Alberta, and they used a doctrine called thinking like an owner. Premier Lougheed talked constantly about acting like an owner, act like we own it. That's what he did. He immediately quadrupled royalties, passed all the wonderful environmental laws Alberta enjoys. We have by far the best energy law on earth. It's just no longer enforced because in 1991, the regulator stopped enforcing the law. And in 1992, the premier was replaced at a leadership convention. And we've gone back to the state of affairs we had in Alberta before 1971, where industry is above the law and we're not allowed to harm investors, and we can only have 16.7 cents of every dollar that comes out of the ground. And I've been studying the history and uncovering the as it unfolds, but then I found it in the data. A farmer friend asked how much we got in royalties. He was writing a blog, and so I just went to my data to check. I looked. I had 50 years of data, 1971 when we had that new government, up to 2018. So this is the period where we had democracy, and then after 91, it faded away. And I did the simple number of what was the value of all the oil and gas and what was the number that we collected. And I scared myself because the answer was 16.7 cents. Like there was a law, a higher power determining the complexity of the royalty regime, the different tiers and vintages, the market prices up and down on over 50 years and trillions of dollars of resources. The answer is from March 1948 that we can have 16.7 cents. And that's the iron rule that explains the crazy politics we have in Alberta, where we elected a progressive government in 2015. Friends of mine, I was friends with a number of the cabinet ministers that advised the finance minister his first year in office, and they won the election because they promised a royalty review. Everyone in Alberta knows we're getting robbed. They can see what's in front of their nose. Everybody works in the industry, has family that works in the industry. We know how much money is going around. And yet we've had deficits as a province since 2008 because we collect 5 cents a dollar. Everybody knows, but this is what explains the politics. There's this iron rule behind it, and it manifests itself today. The industry doesn't pay taxes. Since the last election, there's $500 million of unpaid property taxes for these old oil and gas sites that are in municipalities, and they just don't pay their taxes. And for 5 years, while our premier, he was the former president of the Taxpayers Federation, he just never collected their taxes, never came up with a plan, never punished them. And the strangest part is, in 5 years and $500 million of unpaid taxes, not a single one of those companies has been named in the media. We don't, it's, there's no debate about these issues. And the root of it is the economists confusing everybody about what's really in front of our noses.
Right, right. So, what are the challenges? Because you're in the position of running with the Green Party, and I want to bring in Steve because he's going to have a perspective on this too. What are the challenges running in a smaller party, media wise, funding wise? What are those true challenges? What are the barriers they're creating in the process of real change in a specific region or nation, depending on where the political system is? That is for you, Mr. Boychuk.
Oh, sorry. Steve's on mute.
No,
You were asking?
I'm asking you.
Oh, sorry. You were
I'll bring
I thought
him.
you were asking Steve
No. I'll bring him in a second because he's got
Okay.
probably a relative story, but I want to hear your perspective first.
Yeah, so I've been working on these issues for many years. I'm well-known critic. I've written many articles. I know every journalist that works on these issues. Uh, but nobody's talking about these issues today. Well, all the op-eds, there's no attention to these issues right now. So while these issues are compelling and important, uh, Albertans aren't aware of them. And another major problem in Alberta is we suffer from severe Stockholm syndrome. Of we associate with our captors. We think of their interests as ours, and they couldn't be more different. And there's a severe threat, a worry across the spectrum to talk critically about any of these issues. People are nervous to talk at Tim Hortons, let alone publicly make a donation to someone like the Green Party. The political climate is very hostile here. There's less candidates than the 100 less than the last election, so it's very
Regan,
tough to get the word out.
Regan, tell the
Mhm.
viewers, because we have a global audience, what is Tim Hortons?
Oh, that's about as Canadian as it gets. A coffee string chain in Alberta or Canada that makes very mediocre coffee on every corner and is a part of culture like craft dinner and for
Well,
the same
don't
sort of reasons.
don't get into craft dinner because we have a global audience, and I found out most people just call it mac and cheese. So let's go back. What are the difficulties in running in a smaller party? And then I'm going to bring in Steve. What are those difficulties? Do you have to knock on doors more? You don't get media appearances. What are those difficulties for you as an MLA running?
Well, the challenges can be overcome. The challenges is money. We don't get easy attention. We don't have lots of money. We don't have professionals. But with a compelling story and important issues, we do have volunteers. And so it's mostly a matter of effort. There's only so many doors. I live in a beautiful, mostly rural Banff, Canmore, Bragg Creek. There's not a whole lot of doors to knock on. And with some volunteers and concerted effort, you can make a real big impact without any funding. And you could change people's minds, reach them on the sort of scale of my riding. Province wide, it's much more difficult. But having a little riding to fight in is somewhere where committed individuals can easily make a difference. It happens all the time in politics. If I had 6 months with volunteers knocking on every door, sharing the story, could win a seat. Uh, it's not quite I'm not quite so prepared. I don't have the funding, but I finally have the story prepared. Have an event later today, a couple 100 meters down the road at the community hall to present my new iron rule of Canadian politics to help make sense of their choice on the 29th. But it certainly is possible, and there's ways to overcome it. And um, I don't and I found the volunteers. The story and the opportunity of this election with the third party has. It's not just my friends and family. There are folks that care about this stuff and understand they need to get engaged to change things because it comes down to the root of the problem is reflected in economics. Is their class interests. And we can't just beg the upper classes with truth and argument and hoping they're going to serve our interests because they're not. Our classes have to get engaged and start setting policy instead of begging for favors. And we learned that the hard way with the last government in Alberta, that the ballot box didn't solve all our problems and the existing political parties didn't listen and reform and answer. And so, learned that lesson last time. This election, still unable to fix it in the meantime. So get involved. And the Green Party was the right place at the right time, with folks like me that cared and committed and uniquely willing to talk about these oil and gas issues that are just verboten around here.
Right. I'll bring in Steve just because I want to hear Steve's experience running last year in an election with an independent party. And I want to kind of, highlight that area, the struggle it is to, meaningful people that should be in charge are running for these smaller parties that get no media attention. So I kind of want to hear what Steve's experience was on that. Steve?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarity between Alberta and Australia and the fact they're both resource exporting countries that charge far too little for their own resources and don't develop enough of their own resources for local manufacturing. So I feel a lot of similarity to what Regan's going through right now. The numerous problems running for a small party. For a start, Australia has a reasonable political system where you have what's called we have proportional representation in the Senate, and I was running in the Senate. So to get a seat in the Senate, I would have needed 1/7 plus one vote, and there's preference distribution as well. So you can get a tiny number of first preferences. We had lots of seconds and thirds and fourth and get elected. The difficulty for our party was we got no visibility. As Regan's saying, you haven't got any money, and with money you can buy attention. Without money you can't. So we relied upon foot soldiers, volunteers, uh, we had one candidate who thought he had a reasonable chance of getting about 10% of the vote, and then because of the preferential voting system, potentially knocking out others and maybe winning his seat. Well, he got less than half of 1%. And what would actually happen is people would be very happy to tell you, oh, we like your party and we like your policies, and yeah, I'm going to vote for you. Maybe, they'd say. But when it came to crunch, they think, oh, well, the other non-orthodox candidate, in this case, we had another group called the Teals, who were running at the same time on similar issues to us, but they got substantial funding from a billionaire, and then from a campaign the billionaire organised. They got a large amount of money. They could put themselves forward. They were seen as the real prospect by most voters, so they'd say yes to us and they'd vote for them. And consequently, we got no representation whatsoever. So Regan, I'm glad you're running for the Greens, which at least is a more substantial party. And what is the voting system? Do you have is it compulsory or optional? Do you have preferential voting or first past the post? And are you running for a local candidate? Are you running at the Senate level? What are the details there?
Yeah, we don't have a Senate at the provincial level. First past the post. That's probably the biggest obstacle to a foothold to getting a seat. It's an enormous inertia to overcome in one place and leads to enormous fear on the part of voters about wasting vote. You can think about on the provincial level, there's a lot of people who don't vote. They're not necessarily been wasted, but on a constituency level, it can be split, and people are very concerned about splitting. There are a number of other third parties, but they're quite small compared. And so the Green Party main part of our platform is a commitment to proportional representation to remove that. That's something, for instance, the federal government promised in the last election campaign and then pulled the rug away after the election, as is typical. But the Green Party is quite committed to proportional representation so that whatever is accomplished in the first term could be defended the next term, because the same difficulties would first past the post is a huge obstacle. But the riding that I'm in is largely rural. It went to the centrist party 2 elections ago, the right-wing party in the last election. Both of them think they can win it. They're spending lots of money. There's lots of signs. And so it's a difficult position to be on the constituency level in the first past the post system. But anywhere in this close 49-51 split is a big opportunity for the Green Party. And our leader in the capital is in an urban riding, and he has a good shot at it. And if this story got out, if Albertans understood the stakes and what was up for grabs, that we have a choice between two comprador parties and one committed to acting like an owner, like we used to, would change dramatically. And so we'll keep struggling, and because things could change quickly. There's still a couple of weeks left.
I want to bring in Mike just to give him a little chance to say hello. Mike, my question is just to swing this into system dynamics. Are there system dynamics developed for election cycles? Do you know of any?
The closest thing that leaps to mind is a colleague of mine some years ago built an interesting model, system dynamics model of a political campaign. So it was of the campaign itself, raising money and what have you. In terms of a more macro sort of political economy cycle thing, there might be some stuff. I think a guy by the name of Khalid Saeed has done that sort of thing for developing nations. I don't know if he's done it for, let's say the US or Canada or anything like that, but you certainly could. And that's kind of what I was leaping to mind as I heard Regan speaking is, the legacy media is going to do whatever it does, right? And it's hard to break in there. But of course, today we have, like what we're doing now, we have social media and we have tools that might engage people, taking what Regan's research has shown and building a simulation game out of it and saying to the citizens, hey, come and run the system and see what would happen if we would get 70 cents on the Canadian dollar instead of 16 cents. What can we do with that money? Might we have better schools? Might we have, a cleaner environment, more parks, what have you? And then people say like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize. But you got to get around. It's, how do you get around these people? I don't know. Because, there's so much money involved and so much backroom dealing. Who knows what really goes on. So it seems to me you got to go around them somehow.
Right. Hold on, Regan. We'll get to you in here in a second. We got to do the housekeeping for the show. I'm going to get you to do it, Mike. So here we go. Read them.
Okay, we have Web Freaks, Adil Ahmed Sheikh, TR, WWE Fan 0104, Ghost on the Half Shells here again, The Hasty Ent, Huen, Jens Runberg, Teresa Sanders, and Joe Polito.
Very nice. Regan, what were you going to say, buddy?
I forget.
Oh, you're fitting in. You are fitting in perfectly to the show now. Here's what I want to know. I want to know. We've talked before. We've had past conversations on this show, the second episode, that never actually got put on the Steve Keane channel. So, this is the retake, and we've talked in a previous podcast before that. I want to know what are your, I don't want to say theories because you've shown me the data. But what can the Alberta oil industry be forced to do in relation to cleaning up old expired wells? How does that work? Kind of just lay out that process in a linear fashion, just so the audience knows.
Well, the upside theory is that we're not as stupid as we appear to be. That it's our freedom that's bounded, but Albertans aren't so stupid. It's not so difficult to manage your natural resources. Getty wanted to collect 35, or Premier Lougheed wanted to collect 35 cents a dollar. He was in office for 14 years, collected exactly that. It's not too complicated. And once we lost some of the control of the regulator, we wanted to collect some more of the royalties if we could and make them clean up. So we passed laws to make industry clean up and to monitor the economics of every well. And so we would collect the money for the eventual cleanup of industry while every hole in the ground was still solvent, while there was still enough money left in the ground at current prices and costs that they could afford the cleanup. And if they ran it down past that, the regulator would step in, collect the last couple $100,000 to return that site to near its previous site. And so by 2000, friends of mine at the regulator had designed a system, passed the laws, and in October 2000 announced it. It was developed in cooperation with the industry lobbies, and they announced it together. saying we promise to pay for cleanup with remaining profits. Here's the system, the monitoring, the public reporting. Unfortunately, George Bush Jr. was elected, or almost elected, a couple weeks later. And there was some problems with the recount and the Supreme Court and stuff. But by December 2000, President Bush was going to be the president. And 5 days later, that regulatory program that industry and bureaucrats had brought in was canceled. And so it was never enforced. Still on the books today, we have wonderful laws that say everyone, the polluter pays. Here's the system. Here's how it works. Here's the system to manage it. And they will do it, except that system is carried on for 25 years ineffectively. It's never been enforced. And so, what would happen with a new government that thought like an owner, that acted like we owned this stuff, the rule of law would suddenly reappear like it did in 1971. And we could start collecting money. These wells are supposed to be taken over by the regulator. That's the system they agreed to, that once you ran it into the ground, we take it over, and the last couple dollars we'd use to fund the cleanup. And so it's all sitting there on the books in the law. It was recently fought out to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2019, reaffirming all of it. There's just a strange disconnect in Alberta where the law isn't enforced. When we have compradors for premiers, we don't have the rule of law. And these aren't difficult issues to solve. We're not that stupid that we can't figure this out, that we don't know we're getting robbed, that we've forgotten everything we knew from 71 to 91. That's the most encouraging thing of my research, is realizing we're not that stupid. We're not that racist or dysfunctional. That's not what's happening in our politics. Our politics, like John Dewey said back in 1931, is just a shadow cast by big business. And that's what's happening in Alberta. This 1938 deal where the oil is above the law, where we can't hurt American investors. Alberta politics is just the shadow cast by that. And if we don't understand that, we can't fix it. But just like in 71, if we elect some folks on the 29th that know what's what, it will change just like that. It is Peter Lougheed's famous for saying, think like an owner. And it really is that simple. It's just a state of mind that if we thought like an owner, we would be able to take charge. Alberta is blessed. We have all these resources. We have our own provincial almost bank. Part of this 1938 deal was creating the biggest savings and loan in North America, the Alberta Treasury's branches. We have our own bank. We have all these resources. We should be heaven on earth. And we would be. We were when we were in control, when we had the government serving the public interest. But that was only that was when I grew up. That was 71 to 91. That was the Alberta I was born into, that I grew up in. And I graduated high school in 95 in the middle of austerity imposed by the government, imposed by the same US interests in the 90s. And we've gone downhill since then. We've had deficits ever since 2008, lived on severe austerity my whole adult life. But I studied the economics of oil and gas, and I couldn't make sense of how much money's coming out of the ground, how little we collect about it. Nobody talks about it. Nobody studies it. Uh, it was really hard to make sense of. But folks like Steve Keane, I have the benefit of having no economic training. I didn't even know how to use Excel spreadsheet when I started putting these numbers together. And that was the benefit, that I just stared at it and make sense of it. And it turns out dividing the value production by the royalties, that one simple measure that I started out with 15 years ago, I came back to last night when I looked at the cumulative share over all the years. It's that exact same calculation that I did when I started. And I can explain Alberta politics with that same calculation today. And the root of it is the complexity and dynamic nature of the real world. The economics is hopelessly unequipped to deal with. And that's what Steve Keene's work has really shone a light on for me. The economics of this is really simple, but it's differentiating over time. That doesn't come naturally and is consciously excluded. I think that is literally the reason for academic economists. I think they were created university departments in order to have political economists who can't differentiate over time, who don't know the history.
Let's bring in Steve, because this is venturing into Steve Keane territory on the way economics is set up in universities. Steve.
Yeah, well, that's the effect of it. I mean, I really have to go back and take a good look at when the neoclassicals took over, which was the 1860s, 1870s, because before then you had the classical school in control. And well, I'd like to give you an idea of how different the classical school was to the modern school, even though modern neoclassicals love whacking the label Ricardian on some argument they'll make. They wouldn't like to choose the Ricardian argument that it is the cost of production that determines prices, and not, as has often been said, the relationship between supply and demand. Now that's Ricardo saying, screw supply and demand, it's nonsense. What happens in 1870? People believe supply and demand set prices take over everything. And then from that point on, we've had this same problem that Regan's identifying, that it's very, very hard to get decent state returns for resources that are owned by the state. Because again, you're starting from a mental framework which leaves the state out completely. Supply and demand curves intersected, and under multiple conditions, they will determine prices. One of the conditions, there's no government. Okay? So in that sense, there's a hole where there should be logic, and that is a huge preventer of any progress. At the same time, I'll defend my fellow economists for saying though they actually their effect is to act as shrills for the mining sector, they don't actually think they're shrills for the mining sector. They think they're shrills for logic. And it's a pain in the ass dealing with them because of the stupidity that they can't see in their own work how wrong their own analysis is. And therefore they end up supporting the class interests of the wealthy against the class interests of the poor. And austerity is one of the best examples of that, because as you all know, if you impose austerity, then poor Rupert Murdoch is going to be unable to have an operation done to keep him going past the age of 95. Well, that's bullshit. He can afford, he can buy the bloody hospital if he feels like it. So when you impose austerity, it's the poor who lose the service, not the rich. And again, this is another way in which the neoclassicals serve the class interests of the wealthy rather than the poor, when they believe they're telling us how to run a meritocracy.
To run my theory by you, Steve, about exactly how that works. That it's a consequence of that shortcoming. If you can't differentiate over time, that one shortcoming has I've a whole bunch of really interesting consequences that happen to be really wonderful for rentiers.
Yeah.
If you can't differentiate the outcomes, you can't look at distribution, you can't study the complexity of so classes disappear. All of a sudden, everybody earned their income. You can't study. That's a wonderful benefit of those blinders. You can't see class. And when it comes to conservation, oil and gas issues, it's central again. 100 years ago, conservation was a real public movement. When came with democracy. If we're going to have political democracy, that'd be for the first time we'd be able to manage our own resources. Well, we would do that differently. We'd probably steward this public wealth for the long term to maximize it. And that was a real movement at the start of the 20th century to publicly in public interest manage those resources. And there was a real movement towards that, except economists got their hands on it. And they can't differentiate over time. And if you take conservation theory, which in its simplest form, like the German forest stuff, they could do the math back then. And that simple, they could differentiate over time and maximize the benefit over time. But if you give it to an economist, they can't. And so what you thought was conservation, it's still called conservation. It changes into something different. If you can't differentiate over time, it becomes pro-rationing. You're simply minimizing the risk, the waste today, and conservation transforms into pro-rationing, and that's where all oil and gas regulation came in North America. Is at that same time when the economists made that same tweak, the industry set up the conservation boards. They were really only pro-rationing boards because they couldn't differentiate over time. They weren't actually maximizing the value over time. They were just minimizing waste. And all the academic studies saw that and recognized, and it's just one of the happy consequences of not being able to do the basic thinking And I believe that's why I was entrenched in the 20s in academic economics to lock in this blindness, which system dynamics strips away and reveals in all its beauty. And I think that's a big part of the resistance to anything resembling system dynamics is it takes away the blinders that are key to the whole enterprise.
And that's I'd say one thing that I've just even working recently on the theory of the Therm again. Um, One element of whether you talk about the unable to differentiate over time, they work in a static environment where they presume you're simply trying to make the best out of your existing resources. They're not looking at change over time. They take it on, but they start from a perspective where let's assume equilibrium. Well, one of the classic elements of that then comes down to the theory of the Therm itself, because they say, well, you have the firm should be trying to maximize its profit, so it's be equating marginal cost and marginal revenue, that usual garbage they go on with. But that implies you're trying to get the best out of your existing machinery for the existing circumstance. Now, if you're in the real world where prior to reaching the ecological catastrophes we're in now, you expected a growing economy, you'd be a fool to have a factory that didn't have spare resources in it, because as soon as you had an increase in demand, you wouldn't have the machinery needed to produce for the increase in demand. So if you take a realistic perspective and say we live in an uncertain world where growth is expected most of the time, then when you establish a factory, you will have at least 30% of your capital installed but not used, because you expect to use that over time. And your entire equations about what to do change dramatically as a result of that. But they don't, because they have this blind spot of not even looking at the rates of change through time in their fundamental logic, like marginal cost, marginal revenue, blah, blah, blah. They're blinded to this. And that then ends up, as you say in your case, ending up with stupid rules about resource taxes and screwing the poor for the benefit of the wealthy.
It's even more obvious when it comes to the oil sands. The oil sands produce almost 4 million barrels a day of oil, and they're presented as expensive, that we should go easy on these guys. They're investing so much money. But I studied the economic, and it's just a trick of time. All costs in Alberta are paid for with free oil in the oil sands. And they do pay the costs up front. But as soon as the oil comes out of the ground, they get the equivalent value of free oil to pay for all their costs. So on day one, it looks expensive. They're spending money. On day two, they get free oil. The costs they reported on day one disappear. That's the real economics of the oil sands. All costs are paid with free oil. So it's actually mind-bogglingly lucrative. But if you're an economist and you can't differentiate over time, you just look at today, as long as they're spending money today, the cost per barrel looks expensive because you can't see just a one step removed. It's how the royalty regime works. They're not idiots. They're not all coming here spending this money to lose money. They're actually here because it's incredibly profitable. But that little trick of timing, the little finance trick, you will never find anyone in the Canadian media ever to have described it as profitable. As it is free to produce. It's the best deal on earth, and it's universally represented as expensive because of this simple. Like, there's no one in the business pages, no one in the finance community that understands. They understand. That's why they're invested. That's why it's growing. And yet the economists can't see it. It's not represented in the public debate. That these blinders are the root of much of our confusion. And instead of blaming ourselves, we just start blaming the economists.
Hang on. Yeah. What is the energy return on energy invested in tar sands? Because there is a realistic element there that in the old days of the Beverly Hillbillies, the energy return on energy invested was huge. Shoot for a rabbit to make dinner, and you put a hole in the ground, and out comes oil, tiny amount of energy in, huge amount of energy out. And the original calculations were something in the order of 100 to 1. So for every barrel of energy you used, every barrel of oil of energy used to mine, you got 100 barrels back. Obviously, that's declined over time for most natural, normal oil deposits, and tar sands are the one step ahead again and that. So what, roughly speaking, if you have any idea, would be the energy return on energy invested in the tar sands?
There's quite a variation in the quality, but it's around the 5 or less, and break even at some points. It's
That's bad.
never
Yeah,
made the slightest sense. It doesn't make economic sense unless you don't pay the costs, unless the costs are
yeah.
paid for with someone else's free oil. Then it makes spectacular sense, and that's once again this little trick. Trillions of dollars of resources. Last year, after they paid their corporate taxes and royalty rates, the Canadian industry had free cash flow of $152 billion last year. That's resource rent. That belongs to the citizens. That went to shareholders as dividends and buybacks. We're not that stupid, but these
Mike,
blinders are something else.
Mike, what do you think?
A couple of things are leaping to mind here in terms of utilizing oil revenue, if you can get it, if you can keep it for the common good. I would look to, let's say, Norway. They've done a tremendous job in, exploiting oil and retaining a lot of it in-house inside Norway and using it for the common good. Even in the United States, the state of Texas really ramped up their university system and made the University of Texas system into a world-class university system with oil money. They hired away Nobel laureates and what have you, and it's a really good university system solely due to oil. So, there are examples where this can be done, and, you can get really good results. In terms of traditional economics, and in this case, sort of microeconomics, the microeconomics of the firm or the oil industry, it seems to me that one of the biggest problems in professional economics is we have economic theory, and then we have the real world, empirical economics. But in both cases, we never get out from behind our desks. You either build a mathematical model, or you go on a website and download an Excel file of numbers. That's the real world. And then we torture it with statistics and econometrics and more math. What we never do is get out from behind our desks and go to an oil company and find out what they do. When they set their prices, how do they do it, right? When they set their markets share strategy, what are they, or a goal for a share price or something, what are they doing, right? Now, I'm not sure that you can just knock on the door of, ExxonMobil or something and say, "Hi, I'm an economist. I'd like you to tell me what you do." But, there are ways of beginning to ferret this information out. Retired executives who have had it with the business, and they can say, "When I was there, here's what we did." So there's ways of doing economics and modeling and what have you that I think can yield real world useful stuff. But economists are not trained to do it. I don't think new economics students go into it saying, "Hey, I want to just build ridiculous models that support a narrative that capitalism is great." I mean, I don't think that's why they're interested in the economy and how things work and whatever. But they get socialized into, here's how you do economics, and if you want to progress in the field, here's what you must do. And, so whatever thing they had in mind, whatever their initial goals were, is beaten out of them. There's a socialization process, right? And you know what gets you promoted and raises and whatever, and it's doing economics a certain way. And it's got to be people like Steve and Regan who are willing to say, yeah, I'm going to do it the right way anyway, right? And that takes courage to do that. And we have, like I say, social media and other outlets now where we're not beholden to just the legacy media that can suppress everything. There are other ways to get the words out.
Regan, I'll give you the last 2 minutes here before we go into the second half of the show. What's your message, buddy?
Well, as surprising as my research has been, the conclusion is incredibly hopeful, and is what is motivating me to take part in the election. I grew up vilifying the Conservative Party, confusing it for the austerity of the 90s through for the independence we had in the 70s and 80s in Alberta. And the election in 1971 was an incredible event where we were basically an American colony up until 1971. But Lougheed built a new party with a local billionaire, and the Americans immediately knew they were in big trouble, tried to merge with the party, didn't work, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. In August 1971, there wasn't even really an election. 80% of voters were decided. There was a real local party talking about acting like an owner. There wasn't even debates. The leaders never showed up in the big cities. There wasn't even an election campaign, and they were swept to 44 years in power because they thought like owners. They knew the score, and they did it too quietly. They didn't let us, the rest of us, in on it, and so we slipped back into the hole we were in before that. But the way the stars have aligned in 2023 in May, there's another chance where there's a close election between two parties, and it could go a different whoever gets elected. Our best hope is probably I'm forcing on the change again. That sovereignty is a state of mind, that we have everything we need here if we just act like owners, because the alternative of not being free is dark. There's no bright future when the surplus is being drained, much like India under the British Empire. That's the future Alberta faces. And there isn't going to be a lot of more opportunities like May 29th, where we have a chance to act like an owner and really turn this place around, because the true economics of Alberta is probably the most gifted place on earth. Trillions of dollars of needed resources, even within a resource budget. There's money to clean up, transition, and take care of all the people we've hurt and messed up in the meantime, but only if we're independent. And it's the same message. This is the same issues, pressures, interests at work in all jurisdictions around the world. And for Alberta, happens to be what I've studied my whole adult life. And it turns out Alberta's at the center of these issues, and I happen to be a part of the election in May that has a chance to shift that direction. Everyone knows we have to. We're afraid of which way to go, unsure about the future, and that's where a real economy would be of great value. We don't have any of those in Alberta. There's nobody studying these issues, pointing in a better way. But incredible opportunities, well worth fighting to see what we can make of it.
Well, I suggest you maybe get a spare bedroom open for Steve or Mike, and they can go to Alberta and maybe help solve some of these problems. Regan, I'm really glad you joined in with us for the last hour. Can you stay into the second hour, or do you have other engagements?
Absolutely.
I can see you're camping there. Are you camping, or is that your beautiful backyard?
Yes. Yeah, it is my backyard. I live in a unique municipality in Canada. We're on a First Nations reserve. And so no fences, no business, nothing. It's just homes in the forest, the foothills on a river. So it's something special. This is my riding. This is where I'm running. This is what I'm running for.
What's the name of your riding?
Banff Kananaskis is the constituency. The town I live in is Redwood Meadows.
Very nice. Banff. That's my vacation. That's my staycation area. So this is great. I'm rooting for you, Regan. I really hope you do well. I know it's an uphill battle, but if there is a man that could achieve that uphill battle, I think that's you. Everybody, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video. If you're over on Twitter, make sure you retweet and like, and stay tuned. We're going to be back with Still Friends after the show. We did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it, so fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning. Still friends after the show. I'd like to thank Recast Studio. I use their software to make all our audiograms each week, and I post them on social media. You can do that too. You can find them at recast.studio.com. I'm going to bring on Mike Radzicki first. Mike, I haven't really been sharing this with you via email, but I'm working on quite a big macro model. And I've decided in the tradition of system dynamics to build each component, a small piece of it at a time, and then add the next component. And I'm calling them beta. So beta 0.1 I've done, and I've just done beta 0.2. So we're going to play around with Minsky. I know that's, system dynamics. So we'll do a little bit of that. I kind of want your opinion on some of the structure of the model. If I'm going in the right direction on building it, just, a professor's opinion who really uses system dynamics. Steve Keane, I'm going to bring Steve back on. Steve, you should be happy. We'll do a little bit of Minsky. I was inspired. Yep. Steve has just released, I think, 3 or 4 new videos on his YouTube channel, tutorial videos on how to use Minsky. Check them out. You just go to Prof. Steve Keane on YouTube. You'll see them. Click on videos of the newest videos. Check them out. I'll bring on Regan now too. Regan, you are now kind of part of the crew, still friends after the show. This is where we kind of go off the rail. I'm going to get you to read our top chatters from last week. Are you prepared to do that, Regan?
Yes, sir.
Okay, here we go. Read them.
Web Freaks, Adil Ahmed Sheik, TRWWE Fan 0104, Ghost on the Half Shell, The Hasty Ent, Hugh N, Jens Runberg, Teresa Sanders, and Joe Polito.
So it's becoming quite clear that I'm the only person that sucks at doing those. Everybody else does a really, really good job. I'm gonna pull up the model now, guys. And this will be a little bit difficult to do running the show at the same time, but I've done a little bit of practicing. I'm going to share my screen, window, share. There we go. I'm gonna see if I can. No, that's definitely a shitty view. That's a shitty view. That's a better view. Boy, I'm getting good at this. So basically, I wanted to do a model, that was stock flow consistent, and identify all the structural flows. MMT, of course, has your horizontal money and your vertical money, which is vertical money is, between the government and the private sector. Flows between the private sector are your horizontal money. So I'm going to try to go through this for people. In Minsky, you can set up everything in godly tables, which you're seeing 5 on the screen, the treasury. And the treasury, that's all its aggregated spending and taxing in there. You've got your central bank. For people that don't know yet that watch this show, which I suspect there's very little, your central bank is your bank for banks in the national treasury. Sometimes the states will have accounts with central banks, the states within a nation or the provinces within the nation. I then have a firm sector and I have a worker sector, and making kind of like Steve likes to describe it, triangle payments. I'm going to go into the godlies. This is a feature that's still being developed, but anyways, so I have my banking sector here. And remember, this is aggregate. So this is all of the banks combined. So we have settlement balances in the United States. They're called reserves. Philippe Rochon, or Louis Rochon, suggested that I start calling them settlement balances at all times, because reserves gives the insinuation that we're still using fractional reserve banking, which we are not. So I've opted to go with this suggestion and always use settlement balances. So settlement balances are what the banks have on account with the central bank. The banks also own bonds. And in this model, I've aggregated all the bonds. So you have your bills, your notes, your long bonds, they're all aggregated into one stock. I could expand that later, so we could do things like inverting interest rates. So I could have a 2-year bond and a 10-year bond. But at this point, not an important factor. We've got loans. At this point right now, loans are only being made to the firms. Going to add maybe to households later on. So that's on the asset side of the banking sector. On the liability side, we have firm accounts. We have tax and loan accounts, and those are accounts that the government holds in the private banking sector. And we have worker accounts. That makes up the liability side of the banking sector. And of course, your final stock is bank equity. And banks need to be in positive equity to be in business. If they are in negative equity, well, their assets better be earning a whole lot of money to offset what they have to pay out on their liabilities. That's one of the great things about Minsky is you can set it up, your economy structurally that way. It's a little glitchy right now, these tabs. I had to actually kind of go on Notepad and move these around, but they're being worked out. There's going to be a publication tab soon, and it'll make things a whole lot easier. So one person's asset is always going to be some other entities or person's liability. So in the banking sector, firm accounts were liabilities to the bank. Well, that's an asset to the firm sector. So you can see that stock over in the firm sector godly table is an asset. I've also listed real financial goods that the firm has. And in this model, it's your capital stock. We have the liabilities for firms, well, loans that they take out from the bank. And then we have our firm equity for financial equity. And then we have our non-financial asset equities for the bank. And this goes on and on. Same with the worker sector, the central bank. Now, the central bank, remember I said, is the bank for the banks and the government and things. So for, let's say, the government account or the treasury account, that's going to be a liability for the central bank. The accounts that banks have at the central bank is a liability for the central bank. The central bank also performs open market operations. That means they are going to own the asset of treasury bonds. And then finally, we have our treasury account. And the treasury account is what you think it is. We have our assets, which is the government account at the central bank. We have our T&L accounts in the private sector. And then we have in this model, the treasury's liabilities are the bonds that are held in the different sectors. So bonds held by the banks, bonds held by the Federal Reserve, bonds held by workers, and then that gives you your equity. I'll go back to the model itself. I'll zoom out. You can see in Minsky, you have any opportunity to lay out the model in the way you want to lay it out. You can build an interface. In this case, I've made a cool little interface. And at this point in the model, the way to run this model is you can buy and sell in open market operations, the central bank to manipulate the interest rate. You can manipulate government spending. You can manipulate taxes in aggregate in the whole economy. And you can manipulate the amount that the government uses T&L accounts. And what the point of T&L accounts is to preserve settlement balances in the banking sector. During tax season, you don't want a huge drain on your settlement balances. Because the main purpose of settlement balances is for banks to settle with each other each day. And you don't want the banking sector, through no fault of their own, to lose all of their settlement balances. And the U.S. discovered that in the 1920s. Hence, we have T&L accounts. So you can adjust that, which also has some dynamics on the fluctuation of the interest rate. We can go to another part. I use the traditional, Steve Keane / Minsky / Goodwin, wage versus profit kind of battle here. I'll bring up, where do we have it here? So it kind of starts from here. This is how Minsky looks. You're doing your equations right on the canvas. So, I have real investment minus depreciation equals your net investment. That's going to influence your capital level stock. I've got a price function, so now we get a nominal capital stock. We have a simple capital output ratio that gives you your output in your economy that I call YR. Of course, that can be made nominal with the price function as well. A simple exogenous function for productivity. So productivity is growing at 2.5% a year. Productivity output divided by productivity equals your labor. Labor divided by your population gives you your employment ratio, which is the level of employment compared to your entire population. Made a little exponential function. So that means as there is more labor being demanded in the economy, there is an increase in wages. Not to be confused with the mainstream version of what the Phillips curve is, which is a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. I would suggest anybody reads Phillips to actually get a proper understanding of his work in that area, because it's not as simple as that. Anyways, I will stop sharing. Well, maybe I'll run the model here quickly, and then we'll talk to Mike and Steve and see what they're thinking. Let's go to our control panel. I'll slow the model down, and we will run the model. We already have instant dynamics that are happening. Inflation's going up, so I definitely don't need any assistance from the government sector at this point. Just going to kind of watch the dynamics to see what happens as this model runs. I run it nice and slow. That way I can make some policy adjustments as the model runs. You can see inflation is leveled out and is now starting to come back down. Output is still going up. Unemployment is starting to go down because output is going up. Interest rates are rising because inflation was high. There's a slight lag. Now inflation's going way down. I want some government spending. And being at the start of this model, our initial conditions, government spending is really quite inflationary. The function for government inflation, it has its own function. If employment's low, there'll be more spending. If it's high, there'll be less spending, and you can turn it on and off, and it just remains as a stock. Now we're running at 3% inflation. We kind of want to hit our target. We can do that of one of two ways. We can go in and raise the interest rates by the Fed buying bonds. It's not so effective, though. This model really demonstrates that taxes is a far more effective way to control inflation. Obviously, I don't have a foreign sector yet, so there are some further dynamics I got to work out. So I'm raising taxes, trying to push down inflation. But what's happening is we're going into a recession. But, the mainstream loves to control 3% inflation. That's way too much. So we'll raise. Anyways, that's the model. It's a cool little model. I'll make it available for people to download. I've been kind of hesitant on doing that because it's not finished. It doesn't have a foreign sector. If I go up into the homepage here, I still want to add interest on excess reserves and the discount window. That's going to create a channel for the market of interbank lending, so it'll be stuck in that channel. That would add more realism. The banking sector right now, it just consumes. But what the banking sector is really doing is it's paying dividends, it's investing in new banks, and it's paying its workers' wages. So I'll be changing that. The workers are going to be investing in a future version, so they're buying houses, so there's going to be household debt. I'm going to add an aging change. So right now, my population is just growing at 1.5% a year. It's just one cohort. I'm going to do what's called an aging change. So I'll have, let's say, 1 to 19-year-olds, 20 to 39-year-olds, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, then I can add Social Security payments, fixed income payments from the government, and explore those dynamics. Capital utilization function. Right now, the model is using all the capital, but that is not how it really works in the economy. Steve kind of touched on that. We don't build factories to run at capacity. We build them so they have built-in capacity so we can expand with demand. I'll add inventory equations, and that'll tie in with having a foreign sector so we can have imports and exports. And then I write silly stuff at the bottom. I plan to be Batman sometime in the future. I will stop sharing, close this, and I will unmute everybody. Steve, what are you thinking?
Very impressive, mate. I mean, the level of integration you've managed to get there without the model falling over is quite remarkable. So you've got my energy stuff inside there, as well as the price-based Minsky dynamics and government spending. So what I'm impressed by is Minsky is held together through all that, and you haven't got lost in the forest for the trees, which is another potential danger of adding that much complexity to the system. Did you have various points where it just crashed? What the hell have I done? And
so that's why, so in system dynamics, if you're kind of studying that in a master's, or maybe even if there's some undergrad programs, Mike Radzicki would say, complex big system dynamic models are really just a bunch of little models. And so, as you remember, I sent you about 7 months ago a very large, I called it berm gap model. And I basically built it all at once. And then I started seeing the problems. I noticed, I can crash it this way, but I couldn't find the problem because it had become so complex. I had no way of analyzing. I guess I could if I spent a couple years trying to figure it out. So this time around, I decided to break that model down and build it into separate components. Make sure those components run correctly, add the next component, integrate it, make sure it runs correctly. And that's where I'm at. This model barely crashes. It can crash. There is something in there, and I think it's just a negative value I have to find where it will stop giving its equations, and you'll get question marks everywhere. But that's kind of where I'm at. I'll be adding more and more things. The big thing I know you're would probably be most interested about is adding the foreign sector, which is something I've never done because I followed a lot of your work, and I know that's just not an area you've ever gotten into to a large degree. So I think it's a good thing for me to try to tackle so we can have now. I envision really the foreign sector won't be there. It'll just be aggregated, and I'll have a godly table that will represent SWIFT banks, so intermediate banks in foreign trade. And I'll have another godly table, central banks, all other central banks aggregated into one foreign central bank. So that'll allow trading for the central bank, because central banks trade financial assets between each other and reserves to try to manipulate the price of their currency. And then you have the private sector, actual imports and exports, and then your capital account balancing the other side of the current account. I'll add that, but it's extremely complex because then I have to think about, am I adding another currency? And am I going to have the currency fluctuate compared to the currency in my domestic economy to try to give those dynamics? So that's still a lot of thinking in the future.
Yeah, and I just have to say a couple of things you do, Ty. I honestly don't know how you do them because I designed the program and I'm heavily involved in its components as well. So how do you do those thick arrows, for example? What are you doing to create the thick arrows showing just into the relationship between one table and another? Are you using the text window to do that, or what are you doing?
Yeah, just a text window. Then you grab the one corner and expand the size of the text. Hopefully, at some point in the future, hopefully Russ gets around to actually having a box where you could say what number size you want as text.
Yeah. So you're pushing you're showing what can be done, even though it's barely been designed into the program. So I'm quite impressed by that. And also the way one of the design features of Minsky that I was emphatic about, I didn't want the spaghetti diagram problem of standard models. So I wanted to have the capacity to break the model into small segments and then link it together by having variable names passing values rather than having wires passing values. So, Mike, I'd like your reaction to that. What do you think of the overall look of that top level of the model? If you can bring it back up again so we can talk with the actual picture in front of us.
Okay.
Because I think that side of Minsky is a significant advantage over standard SD programs.
Just let me bring it up here. I went and shut it down because I thought we were finished, but hold on here.
Oh no, they're never finished with Minsky.
No, we are not. Open, share window.
Yeah.
That.
Well, like your price level and inflation. Can you zoom in on the inflation, the price level and inflation stuff there? Okay.
Yes. So I kind of did something. I'm experimenting with this function right now. So don't judge me on it. It's a combination of the markup on wages driving inflation and the supply and demand aspects. So what is the economy producing nominally as output? And then what is the economy consuming? And I've blended those together. And it's going to take more work because if I have a foreign sector, then I have the question, am I importing any inflation with prices abroad? But that's a whole nother discussion. But that's the price function right there.
Just a quick check, the top marks to TR. Looks like my route to work. At least you'd arrived there, TR. If you dived into a ZenSim diagram, you ended up in the overpass, caught in a whole bunch of tangles. So, Mike, what do you think of the layout there?
Oh, hold on. Do I have Mike muted?
Yeah.
So, well, I'm not entirely sure what I think of it in terms of just big picture. It's cool. I have a model that's similar. So I'm, even though we were going a little fast here, I pretty much think I more or less understood what was happening. Steve, you said something a moment ago about, it sounded to me like modularization is possible in Minsky and not in traditional packages or something, or
not quite that, but the fact you've got every element which takes as an argument another element has to have a wire going from that element to the equation.
Oh yeah, we don't have to, that's no longer the case. So we have
okay.
Yeah, okay, that's what I was. So yeah, we can modularize and have super sectors and sectors and subsectors and subsectors, and you don't have to have the spaghetti and meatball crazy looking diagrams anymore.
That's good. Okay.
Now I will add, so it's a terminology is used with VinSim. I think they call it ghosting. So you have a ghost variable, and it's just an exact copy. But you still, with VinSim, I'm not too sure with Stella, that might be different. With VinSim, you have to go to the main variable that you've ghosted and edit there. Whereas Minsky, you can just duplicate the variable and you can edit that variable wherever it is, whatever copy you're looking at.
Yeah, with Stella, you can say, I want a variable to either receive or give information. And then at the sector level, if there's a link, then it'll know that, okay, if you're going to receive information from another sector, what is it? And then it'll automatically transform into that variable. So it's much more convenient than the ghosting and all that stuff that you described.
Yeah,
right.
The one genuine advantage that Minsky still has is the Godley tables, because a huge part of the logic of this model is flowing through the Godley table relationships. And the beauty of that is that you know your financial accounting is correct, and you don't even have to write the differential equations because Minsky is doing it for you automatically in the background.
Yeah.
So that's
the way that's done, the equivalent thing that we do in let's say Stella is you lay out the double entry accounting in the stock flow feedback loop diagram in your equations, if you will, but then you put on an interface and you say, I want financial statements. And then you can just lay out this sort of thing and it goes to the underlying equations and you can lay it all out like this. So it's very similar.
Okay.
We actually, I think he was doing, maybe his PhD or master's had a Stella model that Steve was in communication with. And I didn't see him using that feature. I was just using the Stella reader. But he had to go through a really complicated process of creating these tables in Stella, where he had negative values to get his equity, because it was really hard for me to try to replicate the model. But
yeah, I don't know exactly what happened there. That's probably old school. First of all, you need Stella Architect. That version has this capability, but it's super simple to do these days.
Right.
I think the primary reason that people who do this stuff, we're unusual. They're not economists or modern monetary theorists or anything like that. They're corporate modelers, and the corporate clients always want balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements, and whatever. So that's, I think, why they put in that feature.
All right. Right. Let me stop sharing this so we can see our pretty faces again.
So I do have a couple other. Can I just based on what you were showing us, Ty, just a couple of comments for whatever it's worth. So one is you're exactly right in terms of your first attempt to build a macro model, and then your second attempt, which is sort of big models are built from little models, is exactly right. We've done this for 40 years. I have teaching people how to do these models, and what happens is a newbie will be very enthusiastic. They'll have a great mental model about something, and they discover this tool. And as fast as they can move the mouse, they're laying stuff out and connecting it together and so forth. And then they finally press the go button. And you get negative people and infinity this and dividing by zero and all sorts of crazy stuff. Then they bring it to me and they say, "Can you help?" And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." And I open it up and I see, it's and then what I always tell them is, that's fine. Do not throw that away. That's brainstorming stuff. It's as though we had a whiteboard and we're just laying out ideas. I said, pick one thing on here. I don't care what it is, pick one. And then we're going to just start with that in isolation. And we're going to use a procedure where we test it thoroughly, and we're not going to hook it to anything else until it's thoroughly tested and we know how it's going to behave. No matter how we hammer on it, it doesn't do anything dumb, and we understand it. And then and only then do we hook it to another piece similarly tested, and then we test that chunk. And little by little so that's the only way to do it without having mayhem. And I think you discovered that on your own, tearing the hair out, and then you sort of figured out how to do it right. The second thing is that people have the urge when they build system dynamics models, and I'm guessing Minsky models, it's two ways of saying the same thing, to make a digital twin of the real world system. They model the system. And usually that's not a good idea, we find in system dynamics, because you get these gigantic models that no one can, including the model builder, can understand. Yeah. If you think about it, why you don't understand the real world, so you're trying to simplify, but then you try and build a model that's the real world that you don't understand. You're trying to use it to understand. It's logically crazy. So we say we build models of problems from a systems perspective. We don't try and model the system. So that requires we start with a problem statement. We ask people in words, tell me what is motivating the question, the curiosity, the problem that's motivating you to want to build a model, because it takes a lot of work to build a model. So why are we doing this here? What's the curiosity? Because if you can just think it through, well, then you don't have to go through all this goofiness, right? And then that helps us define what we're going to include in the model and leave out of the model. The rookies want to put everything into the model. They say, what can I put in my model? The veteran modelers go, what can I leave out? Because it's in the real system, but it's not relevant to the problem, right? And so particularly I found with macroeconomics, because you're modeling the macro economy, you get away from, even Forrester did this. He even admitted when he was doing his national model, he wasn't following his own rules, that, he was modeling the economy rather than some aspects, some questions with respect to the economy. So, you were mentioning, I'm going to add an international center. So I would recommend you take a step back and say, what am I trying to do with this model? What set of questions would I like it to answer? And that will help you define what you're going to put into the model and what you're going to leave out.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with that, and this has been my my second attempt here to step back, and that question still lingers. What if I do add a foreign sector? What does it need to be complicated? No, I don't even think I need the model. It could just be some exogenous stock that might just be an epicycle.
One thing, like one obvious thing to explore with the foreign sector thing is the MMT, or the claim by some people in MMT. I'm not going to call it MMT. The claim by some people in MMT that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. Now, you can actually, like, to do it properly, like fully, what you'd need to have is two complete national currency systems, $1, the other euro or yuan or whatever else, trading physical goods with each other, having underutilized capacity, which is the essential element of reality Regan and I were discussing earlier that's left out of mainstream models. So you actually have, as you increase, if a firm makes more sales and it makes a larger rate of profit and has more funds to invest, and that then feeds into the investment sector, and the negative on the other side. But you could actually do it, as you say, just by simply having a foreign sector in a stylized sense, and then show what is the impact of getting a trade surplus in that sector on the amount of money and investment funds in your single economy. You wouldn't need to include the foreign economy itself in that sense. So, like in terms of tackling the problem, as Mike said, that's the issue. If you show that exports are a benefit, you don't need to show that imports are a cost. Okay.
Right.
You need to set up a framework which can answer the question.
So I would be curious, if I may leap in. So Regan, what do you think of this spaghetti and meatball kind of modeling stuff? Because you mentioned in your earlier comments, your Excel, you learned Excel and you've assembled a database and what have you. Do you have any inkling that these tools might be helpful to what you're trying to do to convince people of the efficacy of keeping more of the oil money in your province?
Absolutely. I'm convinced it's essential. What I've been trying to do for the last 8 years is essentially take these two big spreadsheets I have and differentiate them over time, so I can really dig into them, model them, understand them. But there I've discovered the hard way, the other main obstacle to economic or any other reform is funding. And so I have unique and valuable data sets that no one on the face of the planet will fund research into. And so we've gotten some pro bono work for some like-minded professionals in Alberta that did tens of thousands of dollars work doing the initial modeling. We mapped all of our wells and all of our data, and they did all the differentiation for us. We launched a lobby group trying to promote this stuff, spent years trying to raise money from foundations to have a database so that we could offer this sort of analysis to landowners and governments to help. And over, no funding, databases disappear. But as soon as Minsky came out, I read the manual, fumbled my way through, started building my own models. I'm not up to, I haven't invested the time to be able to model my oil sands data to show the economics of it in the real term. But
Regan did ask me to do a Minsky model, and I had already been doing an Alaska project at the same time and all my other things, and I just couldn't fit it in. But Regan, it has been pushing for this sort of stuff, system dynamics, to be included in his analysis.
It almost screams doctoral dissertation or master's thesis or something. If that's to get student power working on it because they don't have to be paid, kind of thing.
And that's where it's come down to. Blair Fix is a substitute teacher physicist from Alberta, and he's been crunching my numbers and doing the differentiation and helping me with that. And so we've still been able to push it forward despite those obstacles. But it's in the way that this is. Steve's system dynamics incorporates financial system is the missing piece from all of our popular understanding. It's the secret sauce of the oil industry. It's all financialization. Nobody spends money. You borrow because those reserves are collateral. And that's really the secret sauce of instability. It's a new source of hundreds of trillions of dollars of unreal fairy tale collateral. That's really the secret to world financial insecurity. In the 70s, you could start mortgaging other people's reserves for the first time. And all of a sudden, you went from gold to gold and oil as legal collateral. Alberta's been at the root of that. And the oil sands have 175 billion barrels of that collateral. It's held by 6 license holders who got it for nothing. And on April 9th, 2003, securities law in Canada was changed so that all of those reserves on that day, for the first time ever, and unlike anywhere else in the world, became legal collateral. 175 billion barrels at 2003 prices became, that's new collateral, just magically appeared in the world financial system because of securities law changes in Alberta. And that's within a year, the FBI was publicly warning about endemic mortgage fraud by lenders, as if Wall Street had more money than they knew what to do with. And they were going door to door in poor neighborhoods to give away mortgages because they had more collateral than they knew what to do with. It's intimately linked to oil and Alberta, but you could only possibly make sense of it understanding Minsky and Professor Keane's work and the financial system, the role that it is the fuel. This is the way things work in the real world, and the ultimate reason why all these oil companies carry on in Alberta massively insolvent. There's 500 companies here that are met, and they just keep chugging along as if the law doesn't apply to them, because literally it actually does not apply to them here. But that makes the economics really confusing unless you understand the financial dimension to it. And that's what's missing from public understanding and the necessary reform.
Regan, I have a question here. I think I know the answer just because I don't think that's a field of study for the Green Party. Let me bring it up here. Since Regan's here, it would be great to hear if the Green Party has any knowledge of MMT. What is the Green Party's, understanding of the financial system compared to the bigger parties? Do you think it has a greater understanding? It's more in tune with how the economy works?
Well, we have the advantage of being made up of actual folks in the real world. So we have a working class understanding of real life. But as far as the Green Party goes, we also have the advantage of we're not part of any international franchise. I don't know anything about the Green Party next door or in Germany or throughout history. That's the color, that's the brand, but we're Albertans. I'm the energy critic for the party. So our understanding of energy is based on my knowledge and understanding, my research, what I can prove, and that's where our policies flow from. That's what makes us a little bit interested. We don't have funding, so that doesn't determine our interests or our policy stances on these issues. We figure it out the hard way. And so when it comes to MMT, the finance system, we're on to that. We understand the role it plays in the oil industry and what it's hiding. Double entry bookkeeping is central to stewarding all these resources, and it would be central. But the main parties have different interests that leave them committed to serving different interests, where right or wrong, true or false, those aren't going to enter into the policies of the two main parties. And so there's another one of the reasons for the third party alternative. Right or wrong serves a vitally important role in the debate and democracy and scholarly understanding. Tolerance and diversity is the only real way to sort out what's actually going on. And that's part of what the Green Party offers.
Mike, what were you going to ask before I kind of cut you off early with the question from WWE fan? You had something you were going to say. Have I ruined that question?
Well, I don't know if I was going to answer WWE's comment or not, but what I was going to say is this. I think a long time ago in dynamic modeling, system dynamics, let's say, we learned how to model what we would call material stocks and flows. The widget goes here, then it goes here, then it goes to inventory, then it goes to the customer. And we shortly thereafter figured out how to do financial modeling. The dollar goes here, the yuan goes there, and what have you. And it goes, the double entry accounting and all that. Now, the neoclassical economists don't necessarily know how to do that, but system dynamics modelers have long known how to do that and have those two kinds of things interact with one another. And certainly Steve's innovation with the godly tables has made that much more easy and so forth. But I think the cutting edge is something different. I mean, we have to learn how to get the material stuff and the financial stuff done correctly. No doubt about it. And not everybody knows how. Not everybody that grabs a system dynamics software package and starts doing stuff knows how to do that properly. There's a sidebar. There was a study done years ago, and it's kind of I don't know if it's politically correct to say it, but it was literally done for the U.S. military, and they divided people in the military into 4 categories. They had high enthusiasm, low enthusiasm, high intelligence, low intelligence. And they basically said the high enthusiasm, high intelligence, those are your generals, admirals and stuff. Your high intelligence, low enthusiasm is like your lieutenants and captains that say, I've had enough, and they leave. Your your low intelligence, high enthusiasm are like your sergeants and corporals. And then low intelligence, low enthusiasm, your privates and stuff that they don't care, they're conscripts and whatever. And they say in system dynamics, it's kind of the same thing. And they say if you're high intelligence and good at the modeling, you can go, or excuse me, high enthusiasm and good at the modeling. We love it. You're going to advance our field. If you're bad at modeling and low enthusiasm, that's good. You don't like it, you're not good at it, go away. If you're low enthusiasm but good at it, we can maybe bring you along. But the worst people, they're bad at it and they're high enthusiasm and they're building as quick as they can horrible models that are destroying our credibility every which way we look. But I think the cutting edge returning back, is the cutting edge, I think, is psychology. That's where I got my research group working. Risk assessment. How do you model that and bring that into our models in a manner that would be seen as acceptable to a psychologist or a behavioral economist? Suspicion of news. Is it fake news or not? How do you add biases and suspicions? How do you represent prospect theory or present bias? When you get environmental stuff, it's, the future is like way out there. I don't really care, that sort of thing. So how do you bring that stuff into dynamic modeling properly so that a psychologist, behavioral economist says it's good, no issues here, right? And it enriches our models. It enriches the interaction of the financial stuff and the material stuff. And I think that really is the ultimate goal. If you got all that stuff interacting together properly, I think we really got something.
Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, actually, I'm at the other extreme, Mike. I think there's too much emphasis upon behavior in economics, and not enough on the structure actually determining how the system behaves. So a major reason for designing Minsky and trying to get people into system dynamics is saying once you've got the system defined, fairly simple behaviors in the system gives you the complexity we see in the real world. In fact, I'm disagreeing with you. This is actually a bit of a conflict here, unusual, because the first thing a neoclassical does is try to talk about rational expectations. How do people respond to a price change? Blah blah blah, with fantasy elements of the reaction there. And then the behavioral economist said, well, in fact, there's all these deviations from rationality, and we have to include those in the model to be realistic. And you listen to, first of all, they're defining rationality in reference to the neoclassical definition of rational. And as I've said on this program a couple of times, the only person who fits the neoclassical definition of rational is Nostradamus. Their definition of rational is capacity to accurately predict the future.
Yeah, right. No argument there with the rational. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But so like what I find is to get the Minsky dynamics in my model, the phenomenon of a financial crisis with the phenomenon, the added bonus, no additional cost involved, of the great moderation preceding the crisis. that actually dropped out of an extremely simple behavioural model where it simply had workers demanding wage rises depend upon the employment rate, capitalists investing depend upon the rate of profit, and borrowing money when their desire to invest exceeded their profits. And that was all extremely simple, and it gave me the Great Moderation, the Great Recession in one model. So I think it's more getting the structure right that matters than the behaviour. And in that sense, what you're talking about, people are on the cutting edge of system dynamics. But to me, we need to think about the poor deluded fools who are doing all this crazy behavioral modeling to make their neoclassical models work, and say, throw that crap away and just get the structure right and embed it in time, as Regan has been saying, and 90% of the behavior of the economy will turn up, and then the remaining 10% is the psychological embellishments that you need to make to fit the data closer again.
No,
Come on, mate, fight back. Right?
Okay, hold on here. Hold on.
I don't know who should speak.
No, this is great. So Dan Sanderson's been fired. We've got conflict between Steve and Mike. This is the stuff that like live streamers have dreams about. Conflicts and terrible resolutions. I'll put my 2 cents in. I'm actually interested in the idea of modeling psychological situations, and I've often wondered, I build lots of little toy models, and I wonder, it's possible, but let's say you're trying to measure a behavior like you don't trust the media. Do you create a unit saying a don't trust unit? And then that unit's arbitrary, but you can definitely get a directional output from it. People are less suspicious of the media or more suspicious, and you can create a unit. As to Steve's point, I agree with them that it's structurally, and the structural understanding of the economy is important, but there are behavioral. I'm going to meet in the middle, guys. I'm going to be the voice of unity, and I'm not going to swear, and I'm going to say you're both right.
And
Canadian.
as the other Canadian, I have an alternative that could resolve the conflict. And that I mean, there's differing psychology. There could be other pieces. I think the experience in Alberta points to the value of modeling criminal behavior, modeling actors that operate outside the law, and modeling governments that are constrained in less than the law, that they operate in boxes that are smaller than they appear, and the private sector operating with the freedom of movement greater than appears on paper. We see in the real world, but in Alberta, for example, there's only one popular theory of politics. We're stupid, and things are going off the rails right now because we're extra stupid, extra dysfunctional, and that could be there could be a psychology at play. It could involve the media. I think it's more likely to involve criminals, people operating outside the system, having a bigger influence, and that I think that's especially when it comes to finance and banking. That's probably the biggest secret sauce missing in the behavior.
Yeah, what I agree with that, and the beauty of simulation modeling using Minsky or what have you is that you can represent explicitly things that are hidden in the real system. So lying. You can have lying in your model and turn it on and off and see the impact, or corruption, anything that you're hiding, the underground economy. And then you say, let's turn it on, let's turn it off. And when we turn it off, it doesn't look like the real world system. When we turn it on, it looks just like it. And then you can estimate, what's the difference? How much does lying impact the whatever? We'll run the model with it and without it. And with it lying on, it matches the data. With it off, it doesn't. And then what's the difference? Well, that's the cost of the lying or whatever, right? So that's the beauty of this tool.
That's the dream of my data. The one thing I've always wanted to do is that we have all of the production data, all of the cleanup estimates for all of the wells, so we can model their solvency over time. And we have laws that say the wells have to be solvent. When they get close, we take them over and we take that money. So just the decline curves of each one of these wells, we can model into the future if they followed the law. If they followed the law, it would have this shape. But I also have the data from the real world. We have 300,000 examples where they completely ignore the law. It's very, and
had the law been followed, here's what the province would have earned.
And the difference between those two lines is the cost of imperialism.
Yeah.
If we'd followed Canadian law, we would have had this much in the bank and this much cleaned up. We didn't. Right. We're in this situation. And I could put a dollar figure on imperialism in Alberta. If I had some funding to differentiate some data, crunch some numbers sort of thing. But it's not quite so simple, despite what it looks like on the surface.
Steve, what are you thinking?
That's the real problem. I mean, what we need is a decent, it's a financially backed set of modelers and activists like Regan as well. And that's one reason, like my Ravel software, Regan, you're probably aware of that. And what I want to do is sell that and be able to finance the type of research we're talking about here. Because normally we're all doing this the smell of an oily rag. You've got to do stuff for free, which means you can't eat, etc., etc. All these sorts of limitations where the neoclassicals get paid. They produce shit they're on the public payroll. This is what pisses me off about a lot of them. These buggers, all about the private sector, but who's actually working in the private sector? Moi, you, Ty. Most of us that are doing the non-orthodox stuff are trying to survive with public support of some description, whereas the neoclassicals are working in, largely state-created universities, being paid a salary dictated by their research performance according to the metrics of the American Economic Association. They have the height of calling us anti-capitalist.
Yeah.
That's a real problem.
So Regan. So WWE fan is a Canadian, so he's got some questions here. I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to answer his questions. So the question for Regan: what conversations has he had with other parties, if any, about these issues, and what were their responses? Have you had conversations with people outside of your party, other politicians?
Oh yeah, of course. I'm pretty new to the Green Party. I spent the last 2 elections ago, the Centrist Party was elected. I was friends with a couple of cabinet ministers, advising the finance minister. I advised the government on their royalty review. Worked with the rural caucus of the government's party throughout their whole term in office, trying to get the reform, going to the policy conventions, deeply involved in the party, but they're top down, controlled by the leadership, and these issues weren't welcome. Within the Central Party, on the more right-wing umbrella of political interests. I work a lot in rural Alberta with the farmers and ranchers, socially conservative, often politically right-wing, but they don't like getting robbed and they don't like messes on their farms. We collaborate on these issues, and there's enormous support for royalty reform and regulatory reform inside the base of both parties. It's not reflected in the leadership. And so there's no official, I've never been able to get a conversation with the premier, the leaders of the other parties, but within the party, there's big awareness about these issues, a big demand for change. And the Green Party, part of being that third party and the alternative everywhere, is part of our stance, collaboration, coalition governments. We'd be more than happy to work with either of the parties in government, because we agree on some of the central issues like this. And so I'm running for the Greens, not because I haven't talked to the other parties. It's because I've talked to them, exhausted all of the good faith avenues that are apparently available for reform between the media and the bureaucracy, the political party, etc. Found them all to be wanting, dead ends. And so keep fumbling around in the dark, trying to make some progress. The Green Party didn't exist during most of the time I've done this work. They exist now. It's the right time. I've convinced them of these issues. And so it's a question of leadership, but I don't have any doubt about the Alberta public, the members of any of the parties. I don't have any doubts about them supporting these things. Every self-respecting Albertan agrees on these things. It's only foreign interests. No one would do this to themselves. And if we had the chance, we'd stop doing it. And so that's something the Green Party thinks that we can have consensus across the other parties. We're happy to work with them. MAGA-esque or not, these issues are central to addressing anything else, and the rest would be details. If we get these economics operating in the public interest, solving the rest of our challenges just be a matter of time and effort.
I muted the wrong person. Boy, oh boy. This is why I shouldn't have fired Dan. Oh, wait, let's unmute everybody because we're getting close to the end here. So we fired Dan. It was mostly Steve's decision. I just had to kind of follow the leader. But this is why we need a guy like him around, so he can press the mute button and stuff. I'm just kidding. He had to go on a little vacation with his family this week. He's going to be back next week, guys. We could never lose Dan. He is the heart and soul of this show. He truly is. He'll be back next week. Everybody needs a day off, a weekend off. He took his. Regan, it was great having you. Thank you for staying the full 2 hours. A lot of people can't do that because it's overwhelming, but you're a guy in the trenches, so you know what that's about. I really, really wish you luck. You know, is it May 29th?
29th, yeah.
May 29th. So Albertans, if you're watching this and if you're watching this later, make sure you go out and vote. That is the advantage of having a democracy. You can't take advantage of it if you're not voting. So make sure you go out and vote. And remember, just because the party you want to get in doesn't have a chance at taking the leadership, that you can still get MLAs in. Those MLAs could be the swing between two major parties, and you still influence what's happening in your democracy. The worst thing you can do is choose not to vote. It's the worst thing you can do. Then you are handing democracy to capitalists at that point. And then capitalism and democracy will never work because it'll just be all capitalism. So until next week, for Mike, Steve, and Regan,
Yep.
we'll see you again. Bye now.
Okay, guys. Bye.